Robert walked into the small, crowded courtroom with a calm, composed demeanor. His steps were sure and steady as he made his way to the defendant's seat. He had been to court before, but today felt different. He wasn't here for any major case. He wasn't here representing anyone as a prosecutor. He was simply dealing with a speeding ticket he'd received a few weeks ago. A routine matter, he thought, but still, he wasn't comfortable with the idea of being in the defendant's seat. His usual role was to be on the other side, ensuring the law was upheld, ensuring justice was served. But today, he would be the one who had to follow the rules. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversations. People shuffled in and out, sitting down in the wooden chairs with nervous glances. Robert wasn't bothered by the whispers, but there was something about the way people looked at him that made him uneasy. It wasn't his appearance or his clothes. He was dressed neatly in a suit, not too different from most people in the room. It was more about the unspoken assumptions they likely had about him. Robert had always known that, in some places, people judged others by the color of their skin, before considering their character or abilities. He had dealt with that throughout his life, but it never felt comfortable. And in this particular town, he knew that his race would be something they'd notice first. As he sat down, he noticed the judge taking his seat. Judge Carter, a man in his mid-50s, looked over the room with an air of authority. He was tall, with graying hair and a stern face that suggested he was used to being in charge. Robert had heard rumors about the judge, how he had a reputation for being hard on people, especially people who weren't from the town. He could sense that today might not be as simple as he had hoped. The proceedings began. The judge called up the cases one by one, his voice booming through the quiet room. Robert listened closely as the cases moved forward, some minor, some more serious. People were given fines, a few were given short sentences, and some left the courtroom with a sense of relief. It seemed like another day in a courtroom, but Robert couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When his case was finally called, he stood up slowly, his feet light as he approached the front. The judge's gaze swept over him for a moment, and Robert could feel the weight of the scrutiny. It wasn't just that Robert was a black man in a room full of mostly white people. It was something deeper, something he had. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. Robert had barely stepped out of the room when the realization of what had just happened started to settle in. His mind was buzzing with thoughts of what had just occurred and, more importantly, what might come next. The weight of Judge Carter's unjust ruling still felt heavy on him, but the brief exchange with the clerk had given him something else to consider. The days following as the legal process continued, Robert knew that the battle was far from over. The complaint he and his colleagues had filed against Judge Carter had sparked something much bigger than they had expected. It was no longer just about one judge or one case. It was about shining a light on a deeply ingrained issue in the judicial system that affected countless people, many of whom had never had the chance to speak out. The weeks that followed were filled with long hours in courtrooms, meetings with legal experts, and endless research. Robert was tireless in his efforts. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but he was determined to see it through. He was no longer just a prosecutor, he was a symbol of resistance to the injustice that had been allowed to persist for far too long. Despite his focus on the case, Robert had moments of doubt. He questioned whether his efforts would be enough to create real change, whether the system he had spent years working within could truly be reformed. But those doubts were always short-lived. He thought about the many people who had been unjustly treated, the ones who didn't have the means to fight back. He thought about how they had been silenced, ignored, or dismissed simply because of their race or background. He knew that, no matter the outcome, he couldn't allow this to go unchallenged. As the case progressed, Robert began to see a shift. More people were starting to take notice. Civil rights organizations, activists, and even some lawyers who had previously kept quiet began to speak out, supporting Robert's cause. They recognized that this wasn't just about one person or one case. It was about addressing a systemic problem. People were beginning to understand that Robert's fight was their fight too. One evening, after a particularly long day in court, Robert sat at his desk at home, reviewing his notes. The case had been moving at a fast pace, and he felt the weight of the pressure on his shoulders. He was exhausted, but he knew he had to keep pushing forward. It was easy to feel disheartened at times, especially when faced with so many setbacks. But Robert wasn't the type of person to back down. The phone rang, breaking his thoughts. It was Sarah, one of the lawyers he had been working with. "Robert, you need to hear this," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "The judge has requested a meeting." Robert's heart skipped a beat. He had expected this moment to come eventually, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure what to make of it. The fact that Judge Carter had asked for a meeting meant that things were getting serious. But what did it mean? Was the judge ready to admit his wrongdoing, or was this just another attempt to settle things quietly without addressing the larger issue? "I'll meet with him," Robert said, his voice steady, though he couldn't hide the tension in his chest. "But I'm not interested in empty words. If he wants to meet, he needs to show that he's ready to face the reality of what happened." The next day, Robert walked into the courthouse with a sense of resolve. His steps were firm, and his mind was focused. This meeting could change everything. It wasn't just about clearing the air with Judge Carter, it was about making sure that the issues they had raised weren't swept under the rug. When he entered the judge's office, he was met by a very different man than the one he had confronted in the courtroom weeks before. Judge Carter looked tired, his face drawn, as if the weight of the situation had taken its toll on him. He had always been a man who seemed sure of himself, but now he appeared to be struggling with something deeper. "Mr. Robert," the judge began, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. And I realize now that what I did wasn't just a mistake, it was a failure of the system I'm part of. I've been part of a system that has failed people like you for far too long." Robert stayed silent, his eyes locked on the judge. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't looking for an apology, he was looking for accountability. "I've spent the last few weeks reflecting on my actions, and I've come to understand that I have a responsibility to make things right," Judge Carter continued. "It's not enough to say I'm sorry. I need to take action, not just for you, but for everyone who has been affected by this system." Robert listened carefully. The judge's words weren't just words anymore, they were a recognition of something deeper. Judge Carter wasn't just admitting that he had been wrong, he was acknowledging that the entire judicial system had allowed biases like the ones he had shown to continue unchecked. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," the judge said, looking down. "But I am committed to doing everything I can to change the way things work. I want to be part of the solution, not just another part of the problem." Robert took a deep breath, the tension in his chest easing slightly. He wasn't ready to forgive the judge, not yet. But he knew that change couldn't come if people didn't take responsibility for their actions. And in that moment, Robert realized that this was a turning point, not just for the judge, but for the system as a whole. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a step in the right direction. "Judge," Robert said finally, his voice steady but firm, "I appreciate your honesty. But actions speak louder than words. If you're serious about changing things, you need to be willing to help us hold the system accountable. This isn't just about one person, it's about making sure this doesn't happen again." Judge Carter nodded. "I agree. And I'll do whatever it takes to make that happen." After the meeting, Robert left the courthouse with a sense of cautious optimism. He didn't know exactly how things would unfold, but he knew that this was a step forward. Judge Carter had admitted his wrongdoings and shown a willingness to change. But Robert also knew that this was just the beginning. They had a long road ahead of them, one that would require continuous effort and commitment. The public response to Robert's case continued to grow. People were paying attention now. They were demanding change. And Robert knew that, with the right people behind him, real change was possible. In the weeks that followed, Robert worked tirelessly with his colleagues to draft a comprehensive proposal for reform. They called for mandatory bias training for judges and courtroom staff, a more transparent review process for complaints against judges, and greater accountability at all levels of the justice system. Robert wasn't just fighting for his own case anymore, he was fighting for everyone who had ever been unfairly treated, for everyone who had been silenced by a broken system. Slowly, but surely, their efforts began to pay off. The proposal gained traction, with support from legal professionals, community leaders, and civil rights organizations. It wasn't going to be an easy fight, but Robert knew that he had the backing of those who believed in justice, fairness, and equality. And that made all the difference. His meeting with Judge Carter were filled with uncertainty. Robert spent his time thinking about the conversation he had had with the judge in his office. On one hand, he appreciated that Judge Carter had acknowledged his mistake, but on the other hand, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that the apology wasn't enough. It wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about one person being wronged. It was about something larger, the deep-seated biases. The conversation with Judge Carter left Robert feeling uncertain, yet hopeful. As much as the apology had been sincere, Robert knew that it wasn't enough to simply say the right words. The real challenge, the real work, was in showing that those words would be backed up by action. The judge had admitted to his mistake, but actions had consequences. If change was going to happen, it would require more than just a shift in attitude. It needed to come with real change in the way the system operated. Over the next few days, Robert found himself thinking a lot about what Judge Carter had said. He wanted to believe the judge had learned from his actions, but Robert knew better than to let hope cloud his judgment. He had seen too many situations where apologies were just a way to keep things from escalating, where people in power said the right things but never followed through. He had worked long enough in the justice system to know that real change took more than just good intentions. One evening, Robert sat at his desk in his office, reviewing the case from the courtroom again. He carefully read through the transcript, remembering every word that had been said. It wasn't just the unfair fine that bothered him, it was the underlying assumptions that had guided the judge's decision. Robert knew that biases like those couldn't just be fixed with a simple apology. They had to be addressed in the system itself, in the way the courts operated. That's when an idea began to form. It was one thing to speak out about bias, but Robert knew that it was another thing entirely to force the system to acknowledge it. He had the power to do something about it. He wasn't just a prosecutor, he was someone who could challenge the very system that had allowed the injustice to happen. And he wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. The next day, Robert called a meeting with several colleagues, lawyers, legal experts, and even a few community leaders. He explained the situation in full, the biased ruling by Judge Carter, the apology he had received, and his belief that the problem wasn't just a matter of personal error, it was part of a larger issue within the judicial system itself. Robert asked for their input, knowing that he couldn't solve this alone. The room was silent for a moment after he finished speaking. Everyone was digesting the weight of what Robert had just revealed. Finally, one of his colleagues, a seasoned attorney named Sarah, spoke up. "It's clear that what happened to you wasn't an isolated incident," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with concern. "It's a symptom of a larger issue within the justice system. Bias, both conscious and unconscious, affects the way cases are handled every day. And it doesn't just affect people like you. It affects everyone." Robert nodded, grateful for Sarah's insight. "Exactly. And while it's easy for people in power to dismiss incidents like mine as mistakes, we can't let this go unchecked. We need to hold people accountable, not just in public, but also in the courtrooms where it matters most." The group discussed various ways to approach the issue. Some wanted to take immediate legal action against Judge Carter, filing a formal complaint, but Robert didn't want to rush into something that might backfire. He needed to make sure that whatever steps they took would be long-lasting, not just a one-time fix. They all agreed that the problem went beyond one judge, it was a systemic issue that needed addressing on a larger scale. After the meeting, Robert felt a sense of determination wash over him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He was up against an entire system that had been built on years of ingrained biases, and he was fighting for something bigger than just himself. But he also knew that this was a fight worth having. He wasn't just fighting for fairness in his case, he was fighting for the fairness of the entire system. The next few weeks were filled with planning, strategizing, and research. Robert and his colleagues began to gather evidence, case studies, reports, and statistics that demonstrated how bias had affected the way people were treated in courtrooms across the country. They compiled stories from people who had been victims of unjust rulings, people who had been ignored or dismissed because of their race or background. It wasn't easy. Many of these stories were painful to read, but they were necessary. Robert needed to show that this wasn't just his personal grievance, it was a widespread issue that affected people across the country. Robert didn't just want to challenge Judge Carter. He wanted to challenge the system that allowed judges like him to act with impunity, to make decisions based on their own biases instead of the facts. The more he worked on the case, the more determined he became. He was no longer just a man wronged by a judge, he was a man fighting for something much bigger, a fair and just legal system. After several weeks of preparation, Robert and his team were ready to move forward. They had gathered enough evidence to make a strong case, and they were prepared to take it to the next level. Robert knew that this wasn't going to be easy. He was about to face resistance from all sides, people who were invested in the system as it was, people who didn't want to acknowledge that the system could be flawed. But Robert had made up his mind. He was going to see this through. The day they filed the formal complaint against Judge Carter was both a moment of relief and a moment of great tension. Robert knew that by taking this step, he was opening up a door to a long and difficult fight. But he also knew that it was the right thing to do. He wasn't going to let this injustice slide, and he wasn't going to let anyone else be treated the way he had been treated. As the weeks passed, Robert's case began to attract attention. Media outlets picked up the story, and the case began to spark public debate. People from all walks of life, lawyers, community leaders, activists began to weigh in, supporting Robert's cause. It wasn't just about one judge. It was about the entire system, and the way it treated people differently based on their race, their background, or their appearance. Judge Carter, meanwhile, began to realize the full extent of the situation. He had apologized to Robert, but now the issue was out in the open. The public was watching, and there was no easy way to back down. He had to answer for his actions, and Robert was determined to make sure that he did. Through it all, Robert remained focused on the bigger picture. He knew that this case was only the beginning. He wasn't just looking for personal satisfaction or an apology, he was looking for change. He was looking for a system that treated everyone equally, regardless of their race or background. And he was willing to fight for that change, no matter how long it took. As the case moved forward, Robert found himself reflecting on how much he had learned through this process. He had always believed in the power of the law to right wrongs, but now he understood that the law was only as fair as the people who enforced it. It wasn't enough to just follow the rules. The people who made and enforced the rules had to be willing to examine their own biases, to understand how their own experiences shaped their actions. Only then could real justice be achieved. Had shaped the way people were treated, even in a place as seemingly fair and just as a courtroom. Robert knew that this was bigger than a simple misunderstanding. This wasn't about one man being fined for a speeding ticket, it was about the way people like him were too often dismissed or undervalued. And what troubled him most was that Judge Carter, who was supposed to be a symbol of fairness and impartiality, had made that judgment based solely on his appearance, on his skin color. The idea that someone in such a position of power could so easily judge another person because of something as superficial as race weighed heavily on Robert's mind. As the days went on, Robert found himself thinking more about the people who didn't have the same opportunities he did. The people who couldn't fight back when they were wronged, the people who didn't have the means to challenge a system that had been unfair to them. He had the power to stand up and speak out, but what about everyone else? It was one of those long, sleepless nights when Robert made up his mind. He couldn't just let this go. He couldn't allow this moment to pass without doing something that might make a difference, not just for himself, but for others who might find themselves in a similar situation. This wasn't about revenge or anger, it was about making sure the system was held accountable. Robert had worked in the legal system for years, but he had never seen it from this angle. He had always been on the side of the law, always fighting for justice. But now, for the first time, he understood how easily that same system could be used against people who were marginalized, people who didn't have the same power to fight back. The following day, Robert decided to take action. He called a few colleagues who had dealt with cases involving judicial misconduct. He asked for their advice, wanting to be sure that he was taking the right steps. They were all supportive, but they also warned him that challenging a judge could be a complicated process. It would take time, and there would be a lot of resistance along the way. But Robert wasn't deterred. He had made up his mind. Robert knew that if he were to take legal action against Judge Carter, he needed to build a case. He couldn't just go in there and expect the system to listen to him because of who he was. He needed evidence, documentation, and a solid argument to show that the judge's actions had been biased and harmful. That night, he stayed up late, gathering all the information he could find on the case. He reviewed the transcript from the court hearing, carefully reading through every word that had been spoken. It was clear to him that Judge Carter had been dismissive from the start. The way he had imposed a fine without giving Robert a chance to explain himself was one thing, but the judge's attitude toward him was another. It wasn't just the fine that had bothered Robert, it was the way the judge had treated him. He had been treated like he was just another person to be ignored, just another black man in the courtroom who didn't matter. Over the next few weeks, Robert worked with his colleagues to prepare a formal complaint. He didn't want to bring this matter to court just to make a point, he wanted real change. He wanted the system to recognize that biases like the ones he had encountered were not acceptable. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure the same treatment he had. And if it took standing up to the system that had let him down, then that's what he would do. Meanwhile, Judge Carter seemed to realize that the situation was escalating. Robert had made it clear during their meeting that he was not simply looking for an apology. Judge Carter's remorse was evident, but Robert knew that actions spoke louder than words. The judge had to prove that he was willing to change, that he would do more than just apologize for his mistakes. Robert wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. One afternoon, Robert received another phone call from the clerk. She sounded nervous, as if she wasn't sure how to approach him. "Mr. Robert," she began, "Judge Carter wants to meet with you again." Robert paused. He had expected this, but he wasn't sure what to make of it. Was this another attempt at damage control? Or was the judge finally ready to make things right? "What does he want to talk about?" Robert asked, his voice steady. The clerk hesitated for a moment before answering. "He wants to explain. He says he understands now. He wants to show you that he's learned from his mistake. He says that he's taken your concerns seriously." Robert thought for a moment. He didn't need an explanation. He didn't need to hear more empty words. But he knew that the situation had reached a critical point. The judge's willingness to meet with him again showed that he was acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. And if this was an opportunity to push for real change, Robert was willing to hear what the judge had to say. The meeting was set for the following day. Robert arrived at the courthouse, feeling the weight of the decision he had made. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that this was a pivotal moment. He walked through the familiar halls of the courthouse, past the same offices and courtrooms he had worked in for years. But today, everything felt different. Today, he wasn't just walking through these halls as a prosecutor. Today, he was here to challenge the system that had failed him and to make sure that it didn't fail anyone else. When Robert entered the judge's office, Judge Carter was standing by the window again, as he had been the last time. But this time, there was a different air about him. He didn't seem like the same man who had dismissed Robert so easily in the courtroom. His shoulders were slumped, and his face looked tired. Robert could tell that the judge was struggling with the weight of what had happened. "Mr. Robert," Judge Carter said, his voice soft but sincere. "I want to begin by saying that I truly regret what happened in your case. I made a terrible mistake, and I'm sorry for how I treated you." Robert studied the judge carefully, looking for any signs of insincerity. But this time, the judge's apology felt different. It wasn't just a quick, empty gesture. It was an acknowledgement of the harm that had been done. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Judge Carter continued. "And I've come to realize that my actions weren't just a mistake, they were a reflection of the bias that exists in our system. I can't change the past, but I'm committed to doing better. I'm committed to ensuring that I treat everyone with the fairness and respect they deserve." Robert listened quietly, not sure how to respond. He had heard apologies before, but this one felt more genuine. And yet, there was still so much to be done. This wasn't just about one judge changing his ways. It was about the entire system needing to change. "I appreciate your words, Judge Carter," Robert said after a moment. "But this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who faces the same kind of treatment, who is dismissed or overlooked simply because of the way they look. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again." Judge Carter nodded solemnly. "I understand. And I'm ready to help make that happen." As he made his way out of the building, Robert tried to shake off the frustration that was creeping up on him. He couldn't let it consume him. He had a job to do, and a life to live. But the unfairness of the situation lingered like a dark cloud overhead. He stepped outside into the warm sunshine, letting the air cool his thoughts. Robert had been a prosecutor for over a decade, and he had encountered all kinds of people and situations. He was used to standing up for justice, used to pushing for what was right. But today? Today felt different. Today had rattled him in a way he hadn't expected. The judge had been unfair to him not because of his actions or any mistake he had made, but simply because of the way he looked. It wasn't new to Robert, but that didn't make it any easier to handle. As Robert got into his car, the events of the morning played out in his mind over and over again. He replayed every moment: Judge Carter's dismissive tone, the quickness with which he had imposed the fine, and the way he had barely looked at Robert before making his judgment. It was clear to Robert that the judge hadn't even considered the possibility that he might be someone important, someone who deserved to be treated fairly. No, in the judge's mind, Robert was just another black man in the courtroom, an easy target for judgment. Robert had always been aware of the biases that existed in certain places. He had seen it in his work, in the way people were treated differently because of their race, their background, or where they came from. But this felt personal. This was more than just a case of institutional bias, this was about a person making a decision based on assumptions that weren't true. As Robert drove home, he kept thinking about the clerk's reaction when she realized who he was. She had been stunned, clearly caught off guard by the fact that Robert wasn't just any man walking into the courtroom. He was someone with power. He was someone who had the means to challenge the system that had just wronged him. It was then that Robert realized that the clerk's reaction wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't just a random moment of recognition. No, it was a sign that the judge, too, had made a grave mistake. The judge had acted without thinking, without understanding who Robert really was. As Robert entered his home, he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation wasn't over. He had been wronged, and he couldn't let it go. But he didn't want to act impulsively. He had been in the legal world long enough to know that taking the wrong step could make things worse, not better. He needed to think this through. The next day, Robert spent most of his time in his office, going over paperwork, reviewing cases, and focusing on his work. But the injustice of what had happened still lingered in his mind. He knew he couldn't just let the situation slide. He couldn't ignore what had happened. It wasn't just about him. It was about the system, about the way people were treated based on things they couldn't control, like the color of their skin. Late in the afternoon, Robert received a phone call. It was from the courthouse. His first instinct was that it might be related to the speeding ticket case. Maybe the judge had reconsidered, or perhaps there was a mistake in the paperwork. But when Robert answered, it wasn't about the fine at all. "Mr. Robert," the voice on the other end of the line was familiar. It was the court clerk. I'm sorry to call you like this, but I just wanted to let you know that Judge Carter is aware of who you are." Robert's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with curiosity. "I mean, he knows now that you're a federal prosecutor," the clerk continued hesitantly. He didn't realize before. "And he wants to talk to you. He feels bad about what happened." Robert let out a deep sigh, rubbing his temple. He had known this moment would come. Judge Carter would probably try to reach out to smooth things over, to apologize, and perhaps try to save face. But Robert wasn't interested in apologies. He was interested in justice. "I see," Robert replied. "And what does he want to talk about?" The clerk hesitated. "He's asking if you'd be willing to meet with him. He wants to explain, to apologize in person. He says he made a mistake." Robert wasn't sure how he felt about that. He wasn't someone who held grudges, but he knew that this wasn't just about a mistake, it was about something deeper. He had been judged unfairly, and no apology could take that away. But he also knew that ignoring the situation wouldn't make it go away either. He needed to hear what Judge Carter had to say. "Tell him I'll meet with him," Robert said, his voice steady. "But this isn't about personal apologies. He needs to understand what his actions mean, not just to me, but to the people who aren't in the position I am. He needs to understand that this kind of behavior cannot be tolerated." The clerk agreed, and they arranged a time for the meeting. Robert hung up the phone and sat in his office, staring out the window. He knew this wouldn't be an easy conversation. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about making sure that what had happened to him didn't happen to anyone else. He wasn't interested in being just another person who had been wronged and brushed aside. He wasn't interested in being a token example of someone who had risen above prejudice. No, Robert was going to make sure that the system understood the consequences of its actions. The next day, Robert arrived at the courthouse. The familiar weight of the building's stone walls felt different today. He wasn't just there to represent the law, he was there to hold someone accountable. Someone who had made a mistake, but who had the power to make things right. When he walked into Judge Carter's office, the judge was waiting for him. The man was standing by the window, staring out at the courtyard below. As Robert entered, the judge turned, his face lined with worry. "Mr. Robert," Judge Carter began, his voice quieter than it had been in the courtroom. "I owe you an apology. I acted in haste the other day. And I didn't treat you with the respect you deserve." Robert didn't say anything immediately. He just stared at the judge, letting the words sink in. He had heard many apologies in his life, but this didn't feel like a sincere one. "Not yet." "I appreciate the apology, Judge," Robert said finally, his voice calm, but firm. "But this isn't just about me. This is about the way the system treats people, especially people like me. I want you to understand that what happened wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of something deeper, something that affects more than just the two of us." Judge Carter shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he nodded. "I understand now," he said softly. "I'll make things right." Encountered before, the judge's bias. It wasn't obvious, but Robert could tell. Judge Carter didn't like him. Not because of anything Robert had done, but simply because of who he was. "Mr. Robert," the judge began, his voice formal, but with an edge of impatience. "You were speeding through a school zone. That's a serious offense. We can't just let people get away with that. How do you plead?" Robert took a deep breath before answering. "Guilty, Your Honor." I understand the seriousness of the offense, and I'm ready to pay the fine or accept whatever punishment is deemed necessary. The judge nodded, but Robert could tell that Judge Carter had already made up his mind about the case. The judge didn't wait for Robert to explain the situation further. There was no inquiry into why Robert had been speeding, no attempt to see if there were any extenuating circumstances, no real conversation. Instead, Judge Carter just looked at him, his expression cold and disinterested. $100, Judge Carter said sharply. That's the fine for your violation. $100 is what you'll pay. Robert blinked. He had expected a fine, of course, but this felt excessive. It wasn't just the amount, it was the way the judge had thrown the number out, as though Robert was just another face in the crowd, unworthy of a fair hearing. He had seen judges in other places, judges who took the time to consider the circumstances. But this felt rushed. It felt like the judge wasn't even listening to him. Your Honor, Robert said, keeping his voice steady, I understand, but $100 seems a bit steep for a first offense. I'd appreciate it if you could take a moment to consider the circumstances. I can explain, but the judge wasn't interested in hearing more. He cut Robert off with a wave of his hand, as if brushing away an annoying fly. I've made my decision. $100, Judge Carter repeated firmly. Next case. Robert's heart sank. He wanted to say something, to challenge the unfairness of it all, but he knew that doing so would only make things worse. There was no point in arguing. The bias in the judge's eyes was clear, and Robert knew he would get nowhere by protesting. As Robert turned to leave the front of the courtroom, he tried to collect his thoughts. He couldn't help but feel frustrated. The fine wasn't the real issue, it was the unfair treatment. The assumption that because of his race, he was just another person to be fined without question. The judge didn't see him as Robert, the professional, the prosecutor. He saw him as a black man, someone to be dismissed without a second thought. But Robert didn't let his frustration show. He kept his head high as he returned to his seat, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't going to let this judgment affect him. He knew who he was, and he knew his worth. The judge's narrow view of him didn't change that. As he sat there, waiting for the session to end, Robert couldn't help but think about how many other people had walked into this same courtroom, people who didn't have the power or influence to challenge the unfairness of the system. People who were silenced by their own frustration, their own sense of powerlessness. He knew that his story was different. He knew that he could fight back. But what about those who didn't have his experience or position? The judge continued with the proceedings, his voice echoing in the courtroom, but Robert couldn't focus on what was being said. His mind was already moving ahead, thinking of the next steps he could take. He knew he couldn't just let this go. The injustice of it was too great. Finally, the session ended, and Robert stood up to leave. He walked toward the exit, but as he reached the door, the judge's clerk stopped him. Mr. Robert, the clerk said quietly. I need to speak with you for a moment. Robert turned, a little surprised. Of course, he replied. What's the matter? The clerk glanced around quickly, ensuring no one else was listening. I just wanted to say. I know who you are. You're a federal prosecutor, aren't you? Robert paused, his expression unreadable. He hadn't intended to reveal his job, but it wasn't a secret either. He nodded. Yes, I am. Why? The clerk's face went pale, her eyes widening in realization. Oh my! You're a prosecutor. She stuttered. I didn't know. I mean, I didn't realize who you were. Robert's gaze hardened, and a thought began to form in his mind. He didn't say anything immediately. He didn't need to. But the clerk's reaction was telling. It was a sign that the judge had made a mistake, one that could cost him more than just Robert's fine.